Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, and good night, depending on where you are in the world. I pray that you are having a lovely Easter and are enjoying all the chocolate, as well as celebrating the fact of our risen Lord Jesus Christ. As the title suggests, I am joined by none other than Dr. Michael R. Licona, who completed his PhD at the University of Pretoria. Is a research professor of the New Testament at the Southern Evangelical Seminary and is on staff for the North American Mission Board, and the author of a giant tome, an absolute epic piece of work called The Resurrection of Jesus, a new historiographical approach, which I'm very proud to have, though I've only just started to nibble into it. So without much further ado, let me bring on the man himself. How are we doing, Dr. Mike?
Hey, Bob. Hey, I want to correct you on something, though. You must have an older book because
I do.
I'm no longer at the North American Mission Board or Southern Evangelical Seminary.
Right.
In fact, I left both of them in 2011. So that was 12 years ago. You must have had that book for a while.
That'll tell me for just reading them back. I'll pull up the thing.
I'm professor of New Testament studies at Houston Christian University, and I've been there for 11 years.
Right, my gaff.
So a great university, fantastic university, and I'm in the School of Christian Thought, and we have Department of Theology, a Department of Philosophy, and a Department of Christian Apologetics.
That's amazing. Thank you. And thanks for the correction. I apologize. I realized just as I played the introduction that I'd not pulled up any introductory notes. So I looked around, I saw the back, and I thought I'd have it a read. So thank you again for joining us. This is kind of like a part two to the last time you came on, when we looked at the history of the historical evidence for the crucifixion. And it's appropriate, obviously, that we're going to be looking at this, the historical argument for the resurrection in Easter. But as always, before we begin, it's probably good to start in prayer. So, as discussed, I'll leave you to read us a psalm in prayer.
Okay. Well, let's just read Psalm 1. I really like that. It's one of my favorite psalms. How blessed is the one who does not follow the advice of the wicked, or stand in the pathway of sinners, or sit in the assembly of scoffers. Instead, he finds pleasure in obeying the Lord's commands. He meditates on his commands day and night. He is like a tree planted by flowing streams. It yields its fruit at the proper time, and its leaves never fall off. He succeeds in everything he attempts. Not so with the wicked. Instead, they are like wind-driven chaff. For this reason, the wicked cannot withstand judgment, nor can sinners join the assembly of the godly. Certainly, the Lord guards the way of the godly, but the way of the wicked ends in destruction.
This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Okay, thank you. Is Mike okay, or would you prefer Dr. Licona?
Mike's fine.
Yeah, wonderful. I've got this giant tome of a work, which is I'm just tapping into the evidence for myself to begin with. But before we came on camera, you were speaking about how others had praised your sort of introduction to the historical the historical methodology in terms of what it can say about the resurrection of Jesus. So I was just wondering, for those who are novices like myself, could you just put out for us how a historian approaches a historical question, such as the crucifixion or the resurrection of Jesus?
Sure. Well, I would say that there is no standard method that is used by all historians. In fact, there's a lot of debate amongst professional historians and philosophers of history about even how to define history and what it is historians do. So you typically today will have two different kinds of historians, or maybe we could say there's a spectrum. So on the far left, you have postmodern historians. And, there is a spectrum of even those, but the really radical postmodern historians would say, we can't really know anything about the past because everything that we have has been passed along to us through the grid or the worldview, the horizon of the historian. So the historian puts their own interpretation on it. And the past is no longer available to us. We can't get into a time machine, return to it, and verify our conclusions. So those past events are forever gone. And so you have eyewitnesses of those events, and they have their own way of looking at those events and put their own spin and biases and interpretation of those events. And then you have ancient historians who will be taking the eyewitness testimony and then on top of that putting their own spin and biases into it. And then you have modern historians who are reading the ancient historian and they're putting their own interpretations and worldview and spin on it. So we have an interpretation of an interpretation of an interpretation of an event that we can't get back to because it's forever gone. And so postmodernist historians will say, in essence, and I'm talking about radical ones, that the past is unknowable. All it is a narrative, and it is fiction. So, but then you have postmodern historians who aren't quite as radical as that. And then as we go further to the right, let's say on the far right, you will have what we could refer to as a naive realist to say, oh, we can know exactly what happened in the past, exactly how it occurred, and know a whole lot about it, an exhaustive account of the past. And naive realists are just as radical as the radical postmodernist. And there aren't many naive realists today. So you move a little from the very far right in, and you have what are called critical realists. And the critical realist will look at the evidence, at the data, and yeah, there's worldview involved, but they try to bracket that worldview, even though that they know that they can't do it entirely. And they take their hypothesis and try to see if the facts fit their hypothesis. And if it doesn't, they adjust the hypothesis. And then they look at the facts again. Are these really facts? Anyway, so they do all this stuff and they critically examine the data. They critically examine various hypotheses, and they come up with the one that best explains the data. And they say, this hypothesis is what probably occurred. So,
and on that spectrum, where would you like? I know you've only described 3 positions on the spectrum. I'm sure there's other positions as well, but where do you sit on this spectrum?
Yeah, I'd say I'm a critical realist.
Okay.
So a naive realist might say, yeah, the Gospels are reporting verbatim what Jesus said and exactly how things transpired. They're describing exactly how things transpired, and we can see that that is definitely wrong because the Gospels report the words of Jesus differently. So it can't be an exact transcription. And they are reporting Jesus's words in Greek, whereas Jesus spoke those words in Aramaic. And we see paraphrase of all sorts going on, and we see changes in the details, so simple things such as like at Jesus's baptism, did God's voice say, "You are my beloved son, with you I'm well pleased," like Mark and Luke report? Or did he say, "This is my beloved son, with him I'm well pleased," as Matthew reports? So in Mark and Luke, God is speaking to Jesus, whereas in Matthew, he's speaking to the crowd, or in this case, the reader. Now, some might try to harmonize that and say, well, he said it to Jesus and then he spoke to the crowd. But that's really just pushing things. And I think Augustine in the 4th century got it right when he said, Matthew changed the words of God here in order to make it more personable to the reader. God is speaking to the reader in saying that Jesus is his beloved son. So we find stuff like this going on. Naive realism cannot be applied, should not be applied to the Gospels. I think critical realism is the way to go.
Okay, and in terms of how the New Testament is written versus other historical records from the time that would count as biographies of people's lives, how normative or unnormative is it to do this kind of paraphrasing or restatement, or this kind of literary license that you're describing?
Well, a Greek grammarian in the 1st century named Theon, and a Roman grammarian named rhetorician named Quintilian had what are called these compositional textbooks, and you would have these exercises in them called progymnosmata, or preliminary exercises. These would be exercises that would be writing exercises performed by children learning how to write well in their mid-teens. So these are people who already know how to write, to read and write, but now they're learning how to write well. And so they learn how to paraphrase. And Theon, in his progymnosmata, say that these exercises are for the training of people in all forms of writing, like poetry and history. So, and he names some others, but history is one of them. And he says that this is what historians and others do to paraphrase not only their own writings, but also the writings of others. So what we find the Gospels doing was just part and parcel of writing ancient biography and history in that day. We don't see anything really different from what others are doing. The difference is, of course, is that the gospel authors are talking about the Son of God. And so you're going to find miracles and things. In terms of the paraphrasing and the sort of literary techniques, the compositional devices that we observe Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John using are standard practice for biographers of that day. Although I will say one thing, the gospel authors are a little more restrained in how they paraphrase than what a lot of the other biographers of that day did, especially Matthew and Luke. And we know this because we can see how they use Mark. And they stay a whole lot closer to Mark when they use Mark as a source than what even Josephus does when he's quoting scripture, or what Philo does when he's referring to, say, the 10 plagues that God brought on the Egyptians.
Or Eusebius, when he was quoting scripture, I think he often uses paraphrases, doesn't he? That
I haven't studied with the text Eusebius enough to know that.
Fair enough. Yeah, he's notorious.
Too late.
He is, but he's notorious for just sort of like doing it from memory and getting his quotations wrong. But I mean, you're not just a historian; you're also a Christian. So how have you worked through your historical study of the New Testament with your belief that the New Testament is inspired by the Holy Spirit in terms of the Gospels and their accounts of the life of our Lord?
Well, when I come to studying the New Testament, like let's just say the Gospels, because they're the ones that report most about Jesus. I mean, you do find some nuggets in Paul, but most of it, of course, is going to be in the Gospels about Jesus. I just bracket my belief in the inspiration, the divine inspiration of Scripture at that point, and I try to approach the texts for what virtually all scholars agree that they are: first century biographies of Jesus. You'll have some scholars place Luke in the early second century, but they're way out on the fringe. There are not a lot of them. Um, um, and most of modern scholars believe that Gospels are ancient biographies, or at minimum, they share a lot in common with the genre of ancient biography. So I do approach the text when I'm studying them as a historian. I approach them as a historian, and I do my best to bracket my belief in their divine inspiration. And I think I'm able to do that. So for example, I used to think because they're divinely inspired, they're not going to have any kind of discrepancies in them. But, you look at it carefully and you say, well, yeah, you can't deny it. There are some discrepancies. Um, Almost all of them are surface discrepancies, but something you'll have like historical reporting. You'll have Matthew report that Judas hung himself, and in Acts, there's a little different account, a quite different account of what happened. And some people try to harmonize it, and maybe it can be harmonized. But I think there's a cost at trying to do that. Um, I do think that a lot of the differences in the Gospels were intentional as resulting from these compositional devices. So I came to this conclusion because I was willing to bracket my view that scriptures are divinely inspired. Now, I still believe that they're divinely inspired, but as a result of my historical studies, I've had to adjust my view of what divine inspiration means. I used to think that it was a sort of form of divine dictation, but I've come to think that that's impossible based on some of the phenomena that we observe in the Gospels. It can't be divine dictation, and you'd be hard pressed to find some scholars today who would think that it's divine dictation. So I want to approach the text with integrity, and I recognize that I really don't have anything to fear because the Bible we have is the Bible God intended. And once I came to the conclusion that Jesus rose from the dead, I didn't have to be afraid of the other conclusions I might come to. Because if Jesus rose, it's game, set, match. Christianity is true, period. And no matter what other conclusions I come to regarding the Bible, it doesn't change the fact that Christianity is true.
Amen. And in terms of distilling, because for instance, you have the two accounts in Acts and in Luke, not in Luke. You have the two accounts in the Gospels and in the book of Acts with regards to the death of Judas. And reconciliations can be made as an apologist. I've used reconciliations myself, but it distills a certain truth that it was understood that Judas had died. Shortly after the betrayal of Christ. So, in terms of using historical literature about the New Testament, and particularly with regards to the resurrection, what can we distill by approaching the New Testament as historical documents about the resurrection?
Well, we come to virtually all scholars, and I mean, right at about 100%, almost 99.9% of critical scholars who are studying this stuff agree that shortly after Jesus's death, a number of his disciples had experiences they interpreted as the risen Jesus appearing to them. Now, I've stated that carefully, and so they're not saying that Jesus rose and appeared to his disciples. But I am saying that these scholars, almost all of them will say, critical scholars will say they had experiences they interpreted as the risen Jesus appearing to them. How do we come to this conclusion? Well, you go to Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, and verse 1, he talks about he's going to remind them of the gospel message he had preached to them. And then in verses 3 through 7, he spells out that gospel message. He says, I delivered to you what I also received. So he delivered to them during his time in Corinth, which would have been around the year 51 when he established the church there. And he says, I gave to you what I had also received. And of course, he received it beforehand, and he would have received it from sources he deemed credible, probably the apostles or those closely affiliated with them. And Paul had met with the apostles in Galatians. He talks about meeting with them on 2 occasions. Galatians 1, he goes up to Jerusalem. He meets with Peter for 15 days and also saw James, the brother of Jesus. Galatians 2, he went up again and he met with Peter and James again, and also John, the apostle. And he calls these 3 the pillars of the church. And he ran the gospel message past them at that time, according to Galatians 2, to make sure he was on message with what they were preaching. And he says they affirmed that he was preaching with what they were preaching. And now in 1 Corinthians 15, he says, this is the gospel message I preached to you. And he mentions this oral tradition. He uses the term delivered and received. It appears in a form that's parallelism, long, short, which assists in memory. And then right afterwards, in verses 11, 12, and 14, he calls it kerygma, which would refer to the formal public proclamation. So it's an outline of what the public proclamation of the apostles were. And he says in verse 11, whether I or they, the other apostles, this is what we preached, and this is what you believed. And in that oral formula, that kerygma, he talks about the death, burial, resurrection, and the appearances of Jesus. And then he provides a number of names to whom Jesus appeared. To Peter, to the 12, to more than 500 at one time, to James, to all of the apostles. And then Paul adds his own name in verse 8. So he's saying he appeared to me. He's saying he appeared to Peter, to James, to the 12, to all of the apostles. So this is really early stuff that critical scholars acknowledge go back to the Jerusalem apostles themselves, claiming that Jesus rose and appeared to them. And the fact is, we have multiple sources, independent sources, that inform us that these apostles were willing to suffer and willing to die for their public proclamation. You've got Paul, who acknowledges that he and the apostles in 1 Corinthians 15, he and the apostles are under daily threat of being murdered, and that Paul himself has suffered tremendously for his faith and his gospel proclamation. So you have Paul from the first century. You have the Gospel of John from the first century that mentions the martyrdom of Peter, because in chapter 21, it talks about the walk that Jesus and Peter had along the beach at the Sea of Galilee. And he's talking about how Peter is going to be killed by crucifixion. And now John is writing this about 30 years after that event. So he's actually talking about the martyrdom of Peter. And then you have Josephus, who talks about the martyrdom of James, the brother of Jesus. So those are first century texts alone. You have other texts. You also have Clement of Rome, who mentions the martyrdom of Peter and Paul and other Christians who had been martyred for their faith at that time. He mentions the martyrdom of some deaconesses in the church who were tortured and then martyred in a brutal way for their Christian faith by the Romans. So these are just first century texts alone. The book of Acts reports a lot of the martyrdom of Stephen, of James, the son of Zebedee, the persecution of other Christians. Tacitus mentions the persecution and martyrdom of Christians by Nero. That's early second century, though. And then you have Pliny the Younger, who talks about the arrest and torture and martyrdom of Christians. That's early second century. And you have to forgive me, he's the one who mentions the torture and martyrdom of the deaconesses, not Clement of Rome. So very early sources you have here that are talking about the disciples being willing to suffer and die. This doesn't show that what they were proclaiming is true, but it shows that they believed what they were proclaiming is true. Liars might pour martyrs.
Yeah, exactly. To which the obvious question then arises, what inspired these first Christians? And what kind of alternative explanations have you heard being offered by other historians with regards to, well, it wasn't a resurrection, but it was this, or it was this, or it was this? And if any, do you find any of them to be strong in terms of a historical argument?
I don't mean to sound condescending in any way here, but no, I don't find any of them persuasive. And the fact is, a lot of skeptics don't find them persuasive anymore. I mean, probably the hallucination hypothesis, if someone takes a naturalistic alternative, they will usually go with hallucinations. No one seems to take the hypothesis anymore that Jesus survived his crucifixion or the disciples lied about it. You'll have a few like John Dominic Crossan or George Nicholsburg will say something like, they just used resurrection as a metaphor to signify something else, such as Jesus had been exalted in heaven, or his teachings live on today. It's as though we can still sense his presence through his teachings, something like that. You'll have a few say metaphor, but those who want to use a natural alternative will typically go with hallucinations. But today, for the most part, historians or scholars who study the resurrection of Jesus aren't using any natural alternatives. In fact, Geza Vermesh, a Jewish historian of Jesus, said he doesn't know what happened. He said hallucinations don't work, lies don't work. He examined a bunch of alternate hypotheses. He rejected resurrection, of course, but he said all the other hypotheses fail. So he said, well, something happened. What it was, I just don't know. I think that's probably the fairest way to go. In fact, I think the fairest way to go would be to say, yep, the historical evidence we have seems to suggest that that Jesus rose from the dead, but I just don't believe in the existence of God. I don't believe miracles happen today, and because of that, I'm not inclined to think that Jesus rose from the dead. I think that's probably the most honest, pushback to it. But today, a lot of historians are scholars, critical scholars, are just saying, like a Bart Ehrman, well, historians can't adjudicate on whether Jesus rose from the dead because it's a miracle claim, and historians don't have the tools to be able to do that. Now, I think that is easily addressed. I think it's a very weak way of trying to get out of dealing with the evidence, but that is probably where most critical scholars are going today who reject the resurrection of Jesus.
Because it doesn't, that refrain of, well, the historian doesn't have the available paradigm to address the question of miracles. It doesn't yet explain what inspired those people. It just says, well, something happened, but we can't say what it was. And that, as you've sort of hinted, and I'm going to be a little less fairer than you, it sounds like a cop-out. It's kind of like, it's basically, well, we don't want to accept what the evidence points towards, so we're just going to say that we can't conclude that that's the right conclusion. And it seems to be lacking explanatory power. Do you believe that historians can address miracles, and if so, how?
I do. Here's how I put it. Bart Ehrman has a thing where he says, one of the reasons he gives for historians not being able to investigate miracle claims is he says it would require God. So that would be a theological explanation, not a historical one. And so a historian can't adjudicate on that. So my response to that would be to just take an analogy in science and say, let's say that scientists, astronomers have been able to detect a comet that is on a collision course with our moon. And they predict that on a certain day, the comet is going to hit the moon. And so on that day and that time, the Hubble Space Telescope and some other planetariums at strategic positions on Earth are zoomed in on the moon's surface. And at the appointed time, the comet slams into the moon. And as the lunar dust settles, there's a message that astronomers see written on the moon's surface. And it says, Jesus is Lord. And it's written in Hebrew and in Greek. Now, here's what a scientist, an astronomer would say. Wow, what an extraordinary event. That would seem to require God, and I certainly have no natural explanations for it. But as a scientist, I don't have the tools to be able to ascertain whether God was involved in it. So I'm just going to be left with concluding that the comet hit the moon and left the message that it did, and just leave the cause of the event undetermined. That's what a rational, fair-minded scientist would do. Here's what a scientist, an astronomer would not do. Wow, what an extraordinary event. And that would seem to require God to do it. I certainly have no natural alternatives or explanations for this, but as a scientist, I don't have the tools to be able to ascertain whether God was the cause behind this. And so, since the event would require a theological explanation, and as a scientist, I can only deal with natural explanations, I'm just going to be able to say that the event itself, I can't determine whether the event itself occurred. Now, that's lunacy, but that's exactly what Ehrman and a lot of other critical scholars are saying when it comes to miracle claims, such as the resurrection of Jesus. A fair-minded historian would be able to look at the evidence and determine what's the best historical explanation. What's the best historical explanation of what occurred here? And if it's the resurrection of Jesus, they say, well, the data seems to suggest that Jesus rose from the dead. However, as a historian, I don't have the tools to be able to ascertain whether God was the cause behind this event. So I'll just conclude that the event occurred, but I will have to leave the cause of the event undetermined.
It kind of reminds me of a similar thing in the world of physics, which is that the universe is incredibly fine-tuned in such a way as to permit us to be here having this conversation. To wit, the atheistic scientist turns around and it says, well, we just happen to be here, and it's the equivalent of standing in front of we just happen to be in a life-giving universe without actually answering the question, why is it also finely tuned for us to do so? And it's very much the equivalent of standing in front of a firing squad 10 meters away, being aimed at by marksmen and surviving, and then just looking up and going, well, they all missed. It doesn't answer the question why. It doesn't answer the question, why did they all miss? So
you have to
I
call that
agree.
a long shot.
Yeah, exactly. But at 10 meters with marksmen, they can't possibly miss. So, but I want to touch on two alternative theories. And as a historian, I'd like you to weigh them up against the evidence and to explore them and to critique them at will, or if you find them convincing, then please explain why you find them convincing. The first one being that Jesus Christ was never crucified, and by crucified we mean he didn't die on a cross; he only swooned on a cross, and actually he survived. And what the first Christians saw was not a resurrected Jesus, but a Jesus who had come close to death, not actually died. And that's what the resurrection accounts were.
So there's two ways to look at that, Bob. Are you saying, Jesus survived his death? So, for example, there is a New Testament scholar. Her name is Barbara Tearing, and she's quite radical. And as far as I know, she is the only New Testament scholar who has posited that Jesus may have survived his crucifixion, and that Jesus did survive his. Excuse me, I'm sorry.
It's okay.
That Jesus did survive his crucifixion, and that he went and married Mary Magdalene, and they had children and went off to France or Germany or one of those. She's the only one I know who takes that position. So that would mean he survived his crucifixion naturally. And then you have Muslims who will claim, some Muslims who will claim that Jesus survived his crucifixion because God healed him. Now, most Muslims would say, I suppose, that Jesus wasn't crucified ever, that God just took him to heaven, according to what the Quran says. But some would say, like Ahmadi Muslims and some other Muslims, I think Shabir Ali is one of those, that Jesus was crucified, but God caused him to survive crucifixion. So which one are you talking about? Did
so
God
let's
heal him,
it's
or
the
did
idea.
he survive
It's the
naturally?
idea. Let's kind of strong arm the argument and try and make it as strong as we can. That Christ, he didn't even come close to death on the cross. That he was say at 50% or something after the crucifixion in terms of his viability in life, and he survives the cross in the sense like the Ahmadiyya would say, and recovers and heals and that he's a living person, but he's not even
Does
close
God
to
heal
death.
him or not?
Well, yeah. Let's say that. Let's use the argument that God heals him to strong arm the argument. How would you address that?
Well, I would say, number one, that Jesus. This is what I call my Islamic catch-22 argument. I can show historically that Jesus predicted his imminent death. We've got good evidence for that. So if Jesus predicted, and I'll give like 4 or 5 or 6 different arguments for that, historical reasons for thinking Jesus predicted his imminent death. Now, if Jesus did not die in imminent death, well, then that means he's a false prophet. But the Quran says he was a great prophet. But he can't be a great prophet if he was a false prophet. And Jesus said the scriptures must be fulfilled, and that's why he had to die. So again, if he did not die in imminent death, that means he was a false prophet. He failed in that sense. So in that sense, the Quran would be mistaken when it comes to the death of Jesus. The other option is that Jesus died as he predicted. But in that case, the Quran is mistaken because it says he did not. In either sense, the Quran is mistaken pertaining to the fate of Jesus. Now, it seems to me that the only way that a Muslim can get out of that conundrum is to say, well, Jesus did not predict his imminent death. But, if I've given 4 or more reasons why, as a historian, it seems very likely that Jesus did predict his death. Which one of those reasons do you not like? Or you're going to have to refute all of them and show that give reasons to think that Jesus did not predict his death, reasons for thinking that other than just saying, well, yeah, that's might be where the evidence points, but the Quran says he didn't. So that's one argument I would give. I think that's a pretty strong argument. Another argument I've heard from my friend David Wood, and he has said that, we could expect that God would deceive the Romans who crucified Jesus, the Jewish leadership who instigated the Romans to crucify Jesus. We could understand why God would deceive them and making them believe Jesus, they had killed Jesus when they had not. But because we know the disciples truly believed that Jesus died and rose from the dead, and from that, you get the largest religion in the world, the biggest competitor to Islam, that which is thwarting Islam more than anything, Islam's growth more than anything else. You have a lot of followers of Islam leaving Islam and becoming Christians. God could have just stopped that and prevented that from happening by just correcting the apostles on this and having Jesus appear to them. Like maybe it's narrated in the Gospel of Barnabas, which is certainly a Muslim forgery from around the 14th or 15th century. So why it seems like that would be unwise of the supposedly all-wise Allah not to correct this. And here's the other thing that David points out is that the Quran refers to the disciples of Jesus as Muslims. So again, you can understand why God would deceive the Romans and the Jewish leadership, but why deceive the early disciples of Jesus who are called Muslims in the Quran? And if he's willing to deceive those Muslims, you can't know that he's not deceiving you even today. So there's a lot of good reasons for rejecting the view of the Quran that that God spared Jesus's life and healed him so that he didn't die on the cross.
And obviously the point would be that if we were to accept the argument as being true that Christ was healed by God, did not die, we would expect reasonably to see some kind of evidence of a group teaching that. And are you aware of any group from the first century that taught that Christ didn't die? He was crucified but didn't die. God healed him actually, and then we don't know what happens next in this fantasy, but is there any group that goes on to teach that idea that we know of?
Well, there's boy, I hope you just don't hold me to this, but off the top of my head, I think there's a document called the Ethiopic Apocalypse of Peter, and that talks about how Peter was at the cross or saw Jesus on the cross, and Christ came out of the cross. So this is like a Gnostic kind of document, and Christ came out of the body of Jesus and was kind of laughing, saying they think that they are killing me, but they're not. They're killing Jesus. They're not killing me, Christ. So apparently there was a group of Gnostics who believed that that Jesus did not die by crucifixion. I'm sorry, that Christ did not die by crucifixion.
Because if I understand correctly, I mean, when is that document? Do you know what century?
I think it's called the Ethiopic Apocalypse of Peter, or just the Apocalypse of Peter.
Do you know when it's dated to?
Roughly? It's probably 2nd century, maybe 3rd century, but I would venture to say it's probably late 2nd century.
Okay, because if I understand correctly, what they were objecting, their understanding is that a divine God possessed a man Jesus,
right?
And then that man Jesus was crucified, but the divine God was not.
Like that's correct.
Yeah. So clearly that doesn't match up with the Islamic belief that there was this man.
Not at all.
Do you know what I'm saying? Like, so we haven't even got a contender there. Do we have, based upon the Islamic assumptions that, what the Islamic assumptions held by some Muslims that, that Christ didn't die on the cross? Do we have any group, whether they're strong-arming it, i.e. God healed him, or it's like Ahmadiyya, he was close to death, but he's managed to survive and he's just humanly strong and he manages to recover slowly. Is there any group that we know of in historical terms, 1st century evidence, 2nd century evidence, that teach that?
I'm not aware of any group. I believe that Celsus in the 2nd century, he was a skeptic, and in his treatment against Christianity, I think he suggested that maybe Jesus's death was faked, or he learned some magic and was able to fake his death.
From Egypt. Yeah. He learned the magic. Yeah.
but he's just a single skeptic, and he's just coming up. I mean, it's obvious when you read Celsus, and by the way, Celsus's work has vanished, but scholars think that most of it has been reproduced by Origen in the early 3rd century when he wrote Contra Celsum, because he quotes Celsus and then he responds to him. So it's like a line by line almost that he quotes Celsus and responds to him. So it becomes obvious as you're reading Celsus that he's just coming up. He's just straining to get anything he can in order to come against Christianity.
So basically, we have, from a historical point of view, nothing to support the idea of the swoon theory.
That's correct. Nothing in terms of groups,
no books.
And we have no really good reasons, medically or historically speaking, to think Jesus survived his crucifixion.
Right. And just why are you so confident to make such a bold statement? You know, that there's no reason to believe that Christ could have survived his crucifixion. I mean, I'm saying bold because I'm playing devil's advocate. It's obviously not controversial.
You know, before Mel Gibson's movie, The Passion of the Christ, came out in 2004, I remember when I saw previews of it or trailers of it, and I got really excited about seeing this. The trailers themselves were just really gripping and just made me really excited about seeing the movie. I think they started coming out maybe a year before the movie came out. And so I decided to do a deep dive myself into the ancient sources to find out what crucifixion and the tortures that preceded them were like. And it was the most sobering study I've ever done. There were times I just had to close the books and walk away because it was so disturbing. So when you learn about what scourging was, it was a brutal process. You have Josephus, who talked about how a Roman governor scourged some Jews, and he scourged them, whipped them to the bone, so their bones could be seen. And he also talks about a guy named Jesus. It's not the same Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus, by the way, Yeshua, Joshua, was a very popular name. It was one of the, I think it was number 7 for the 7 most popular male Jewish name in Palestine at that time. So there were a lot of Jesuses, you could say, that were walking around in Palestine. Well, in the 60s, mid 60s, there was a guy named Jesus, and he was foretelling of the temple's destruction. And they thought that he was crazy. The Jews were complaining. The Romans arrested him. The Roman governor did, and had him whipped to the bone, scourged to the bone. And yet he just kept crying out that the temple was going to be destroyed. And we know just within a few years it was. So we do have a couple of accounts of what scourging was like. So if you're getting whipped to the bone, that's pretty brutal. Then you have people who have done studies on crucifixion, people getting impaled and where they would have been impaled and how death by asphyxiation would have occurred. And you just start to realize that there is no conceivable way that a person who had really gone through the rigors of scourging and then crucifixion, the chances of survival were very low. In fact, we only have 2 accounts in antiquity of a person actually surviving crucifixion. Josephus mentions 2 of his friends being crucified during the fall of Jerusalem. And he went to his friend, the Roman commander Titus, and asked a favor that he spare their lives. And Titus, out of friendship to Josephus, ordered that all 3 be removed from their crosses and provided medical care. But in spite of this, 2 of the 3 still died. And we don't know whether they were scourged or tortured beforehand. The other comes from Herodotus. I wasn't aware of this until Dale Allison mentioned it in his book on the resurrection. But we don't know if this guy was tortured beforehand. We don't even know if he was impaled to a cross with nails, or whether he was just strung up, or whether they even intended to kill him or just have him in discomfort on the cross for a while. But he was removed and intentionally and survived. But other than that, we have no reason to think that anyone who was crucified survived it. And even if, on the very small chance that Jesus did survive his crucifixion, what would he have looked like after being scourged, after being beaten, and after being impaled by nails? He wouldn't have been able to walk. He would certainly not been able to convince his disciples that he had been resurrected in an immortal body. Alive, yes, but resurrected, not a chance. So that's why you just don't have critical historians today even considering the possibility as a live option that Jesus actually survived his crucifixion.
And is it pretty? And I know from last time it's quite unanimous among skeptics and Christian historians alike that Christ was crucified. It's not really a debated point amongst historians, is it? At that point,
that's correct. It's not.
Yeah.
It's mentioned in early sources such as Paul, who's writing very early. It's mentioned in the Gospels that are all biographies written in the first century. So within, say, 65 years, 20 to 65 years of Jesus's death, which is very early by ancient standards. You've got even non-Christian, unsympathetic sources that are mentioning it, like Josephus, Tacitus, Lucian, Mara Bar Serapion. They all mention Jesus's execution by the Romans. So there's really no good reason to deny Jesus' death by crucifixion. And in fact, with all the evidence we have for Jesus's death by crucifixion in the first century, without any good, compelling evidence to the contrary, the historian at least has to conclude that Jesus was crucified and that the process killed him. Now, of course, if you're a skeptic on the internet and you want to, posit something otherwise, by all means, you're welcome to do that. But, don't expect sober-minded people who are trained in history to follow you on it.
No, I think by his death and his crucifixion, our Lord basically destroys Islam's claims. And the obvious counter that Muslims make is Christ wasn't crucified. He was never crucified. Someone else was crucified in his place. But then the rejoinder to that is obviously, well, what did they see? Why were they convinced that there was a resurrection in the first place? Why did anybody start going around? To which, Muslims come back, well, Paul made it up. Paul invented the whole thing. He invented the resurrection. He invented the idea that Jesus Christ was God. It was all Paul's fault. Paul invented your religion. How would you, as a historian, reply to that argument?
Well, I'd say before the 1980s, some scholars held on to that, but it's not been held by scholars really since then. It's been abandoned, and rightly so, because we know that through Paul, he says that he ran the gospel message he had been preaching past the Jerusalem apostles, the pillars of the church, Peter, James, and John, to ensure that he was on message with what they were proclaiming. That doesn't mean he's preaching everything that they're proclaiming, but he is, because we even know that there was some disputes in the church, about whether Christians could eat meat that were sacrificed to idols, whether Jewish Christians could eat alongside Gentile Christians, things like that, whether Jewish Christians needed to maintain temple purification rites, whether Gentile male Christians needed to be circumcised. I mean, you had disputes like this about the minutia of the law, the Jewish law. But it seems that they are putting their stamp of approval on Paul's gospel message, the essential message of the Christian faith. Now you say, well, yeah, but where is that reported? That's in Acts, the book of Acts, written by Luke, who was a traveling companion of who? Paul. And then you have Paul himself saying it, but we don't have any of the apostles coming out and saying it. Well, that's true, but you do have people who probably knew the apostles, Peter and John. The one that probably knew Peter was Clement of Rome, and the one who knew John, probably knew John, was Polycarp. And so it'd be interesting to see how they refer to Paul in their writings. So we do have a letter written by Clement of Rome. It's called First Clement. It was written in the 90s. So roughly around the same time as the Gospel of John was written. At least that's where the majority of scholars today place it. But there's a growing number who are placing it in the mid to late 60s. And I think that the arguments for it are quite persuasive. But in the end, whether it's the mid 60s or the early to mid 90s, we just can't know for sure. But here Clement is writing, and he places Paul on par with his mentor Peter, and he refers to Paul as the blessed Paul. Now, that's not the kind of things you say about Paul if he was teaching a gospel message that was essentially different than what his mentor Peter was teaching. And then you have Polycarp, who says that Paul accurately and reliably taught the message of truth. And that's a direct quote. And then he quotes from one of Paul's letters and refers to it as part of the sacred scriptures. That is not the kind of thing that you say about Paul if his gospel message was essentially different than Polycarp's mentor, John. But it is the same, precisely the kind of thing that you would say of Paul if he had been telling the truth that Peter, James, and John had verified, had certified that Paul's gospel message was in alignment with their own. So we also see Paul being very careful with the Jesus tradition. So in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, Paul addresses or answers a number of questions the Corinthians have asked him. The first question they ask him is about marriage. Paul, can we get married? Is it okay to get married? And Paul says, yeah, it's okay. He says, I think you do better in the current climate of persecution if you don't get married, because if you get married and, persecution comes around, you're going to be concerned about your spouse and their safety and, your family. So I don't want that to be a pressure on you. And besides, if you remain single, and Paul says, as he's chosen, he has more time and emotional effort and financial resources in order to serve Christ. He says, but this is just my opinion. I think that there are good reasons for staying single, but if you want to get married, by all means, get married. You're not sinning. You're doing all right. But then he turns to the matter of divorce. Is it okay to divorce? And here Paul says, not I, but the Lord, which means he's no longer giving his opinion on the matter. He is now appealing to the teachings of Jesus. And then he goes and he pretty much says, if unless your spouse commits adultery, then you're bound to your spouse. Do not divorce. And then the third question, well, Paul, what if I'm married to a non-believer? And then he makes that statement that has confused many. He says, not the Lord, but I. Now, what does he mean by that? Is this like, well, this is no longer the red letter edition of our Bible? We don't have to obey Paul on this. This is just his opinion again. No. And he says, look, if you're married to a non-believer and the non-believer wants to divorce, then you are free to divorce them and free to remarry. But if that non-believer wants to stay married, then you need to stay married to them, because the Lord may use you to lead that person to Christ. And then he says, this is my command. So pass it along in the churches. So this is no longer an opinion that Paul has. It's his apostolic ruling. It has authority in it now. So the point here is that Paul is being painfully careful to distinguish his own authoritative ruling and teaching from that of Jesus. And so when it comes to the Jesus tradition, he is considering that sacred, and he's not going to change that. So Paul, in his practice, as well as what we see his case before the Jerusalem apostles, he is preaching the same gospel message they're preaching: the death, deity, resurrection, and appearances of Jesus.
And yeah, I think that you touched on a good point when you mentioned the church fathers, because you've also got the founder of the Coptic Church, Mark. He the universality of the acceptance of Paul as an apostle, who didn't found every church. He didn't go and found every church. Many of these churches, like the church in Rome, rose up independently of Paul. They were founded by others apart from Paul, and Paul writes to them, meaning that someone else had done the work, not Paul. And the fact that he's accepted by churches across the Mediterranean world as being one of the apostles demonstrates that he was not seen as some kind of imposter. But in terms of the fact that the faith, how reliable is it to say that Paul was a persecutor of the church historically?
Well, Paul himself acknowledges it in his letters. There are 13 letters attributed to Paul in the New Testament, and of those, scholars are unanimous that he wrote at least 7 of them, and then they're divided 50-50 on 2 others, and then there are 4 that the majority of critical scholars think Paul did not write. Now, I'm not saying things one way or the other. I for those 4, I haven't really looked into it to come up with my own opinion. So I kind of default to, what I believed all along, that Paul wrote them, but I don't hold that nearly as strongly as I do with the others, until I can look at it and make my own judgment on it. But Paul himself, in his undisputed letters, talks about being a persecutor of the church. So he says it in 1 Corinthians 15. He says it in Philippians, might be chapter 3, Philippians chapter 3, where he talked about being a persecutor of the church. I know it's in Philippians. I just forgot what chapter it's in. So Paul himself acknowledges it. You have the book of Acts, who talks about Paul's persecuting activities. In Galatians chapter 1, I think it's verse 23, Paul says that in Jerusalem they hadn't seen him, but it was going around saying that he who persecuted the church now proclaims the faith he once sought to destroy. So it seems like Paul is appealing to some oral tradition about him that was going around in Jerusalem at that time. So we have good reason to think that Paul was a persecutor of the church. And let me get just back, because Paul himself acknowledges it. But let me just backtrack a little bit. There's something else that we can add to Paul not inventing Christianity, like the resurrection and the deity of Christ. The majority of critical scholars today go with the traditional authorship of Mark's gospel, that Mark wrote it and that his primary source was Peter. Now, I know that some would jump and say, well, that's someone like a Bart Ehrman would jump at that and say, no, that's false. Majority of critical scholars say we don't have any idea who wrote Mark. Well, that is false, and that's provable. I had a student at Houston Christian University, a grad student, who I supervised his master's thesis. His name is Joshua Pelletier, and he's currently augmenting that thesis now in his PhD work. So he surveyed over 200 critical New Testament scholars writing in English since 1965, I think through probably 2019, over 200. And he found that the majority of them who comment on this, the prolegomena related to Mark, think that Mark wrote it. They agree with the traditional authorship, and they agree that Mark's primary source was Peter. So you've got Mark's gospel rooted in the eyewitness testimony of Peter, who is, they report his resurrection and his claims to deity in Mark's gospel. Even Bart Ehrman will acknowledge that Mark portrays Jesus as being divine. And it's pretty clear in Mark's gospel that he's doing that, especially when you look at it through the lens of ancient biography. And then you have John's gospel. Now, the majority of critical scholars today don't think that John, the son of Zebedee, wrote John's gospel, but they do think that the Gospel of John was written either by a minor disciple who had traveled with Jesus, or that the author of John's gospel, whoever it may have been, used one of Jesus's disciples, an eyewitness, as their primary source. And so you have John's gospel talk about the deity and resurrection of Jesus. So in addition to Paul claiming it and saying that his gospel message is the same as the Jerusalem apostles, you also have Mark and John at minimum that are rooted in the eyewitness testimony of some of Jesus' disciples. And they're talking about the deity and resurrection of Jesus. So it's implausible to say that Paul invented Christianity as we have it today.
Brilliant. And that's exactly the point. You can't persecute a faith that you've invented. It makes absolutely no sense.
Yeah.
And yet there are people out there saying exactly that Paul invented Christianity, even though historically the evidence shows that he was a
well, that just shows that they're being guided more by their worldview than they are rational arguments and an honest, sincere look at the data.
Amen. So tell us then, because our focus is on this most monumental event in history, which is the resurrection. What in terms of the resurrection to Paul, like what was that to him? Like, how did that impact him? How did that, what did he see? What did he experience, as it were? Because obviously he's one of the key witnesses, along with others, but he's one of the key witnesses of the resurrection. And I don't think it should escape people's notice that this is an enemy of the church who has this experience. And I think that's quite important. And so I'd like to dwell on that for a little bit. So over to you.
Well, the only place where the appearance to Paul is narrated is in the book of Acts, chapters 9, 22, and 26. So we just have to go with that. The majority of critical scholars do think that Luke was a traveling companion of Paul. Or let me just try to be painfully careful here and accurate. According to Craig Keener, in his monumental commentary on the book of Acts, which is, over 4,000 pages. I think it's 4,500 pages in 4 volumes.
Yours is only like 700 pages.
What
isn't it?
Yeah, mine's only 700 pages.
You're slacking, David. Yes, sorry, Mike. Yeah. You're slacking, Mike.
Yeah, Keener is he's amazing. There's Craig Keener, and then there's the rest of us mortals. The introductory information alone in the book of his commentary on the book of Acts is 624 pages of small font. The guy's just amazing. Anyway, I'm trying to think where I was going with this now, and I apologize.
It's all right. We're talking about the resurrection.
Oh yeah, Keener says the majority of critical scholars today think that the author of Acts was a traveling companion of Paul, but they do not specifically name that person as Luke. They don't say it wasn't Luke. They just don't name the author as Luke. But I think Luke is the most plausible source there, the most reasonable source. But they will say that he was a traveling companion of Paul. So, he's probably getting this information from Paul, but it's the only time the appearance to Paul is narrated. Now, Paul mentions that Jesus did appear to him, that he saw the risen Jesus, but he doesn't describe it. Scholars over the years have tried to take a couple of his verses to try to guess the nature of the appearances. Like, for example, you'll find skeptical scholars appeal to Galatians 1, I believe it's verse 16, where Paul talks about a revelation of God in him. So it's a revelation of God in him. It was an internal experience, a revelation. Paul had like visions, and maybe this was just some kind of an internal experience rather than something that's narrated in the book of Acts. But revelation can mean like a vision, but like you have in the book of Revelation, or it can just mean like an actual visual appearance, like the revelation of the sun, sun. You can see the appearing of the sun, the revelation of the sun. It's an actual physical appearance seen with human eyes. When he says the revelation of God in me, that's en emoi. And that can mean a number of things. Yeah, if you're going to look at a direct literal translation, it means in me, but it's also can mean to me or a number of different things. And it's used in that sense, like to me in Paul's letter to the Galatians as well, elsewhere. So it could certainly mean the revelation, the appearing of God to me. It could certainly mean that. So it doesn't mean necessarily that it's like a vision that was only internal to Paul. Some have appealed to 2 Corinthians, where he talks about Paul being caught up into the third heaven, but the kind of timeline that Paul provides for that doesn't fit with his conversion. So those things don't work. So the bottom line is that Paul does not talk about the nature of his experience. Oh, one other text, a major text, 1 Corinthians 15, verses 42 through 44, and then verse 50, where Paul talks about the nature of resurrection. And he says, it's sown as a corruptible body, it's raised as an incorruptible body. It's sown in weakness, it's raised in power. It's sown in dishonor, it's raised in glory. It's sown as a few English translations say, it's sown a physical body, it's raised a spiritual body, as though contrasting physical or material with immaterial. But during my doctoral research, did a study on those two terms in Greek. Every time they appeared from the 8th century BC through the 3rd century, hundreds of occasions for 800 and some occasions for the word that's translated by some, like the New Revised Standard Version and a few others, as physical. I think it's like 846 times. And it never means that. Not once does it mean physical. It means natural on most occasions. And the term spiritual, pneumatikos, it can mean immaterial, but Paul doesn't use it in that sense there. In fact, just a few chapters earlier, he uses the same two terms. He says the natural, psychikos, the one that is some English translations render it as physical. The natural man doesn't understand the things of the spirit, for they are spiritually, pneumatikos, interpreted. And then if Paul wanted to use these two terms to contrast natural or physical and spiritual, he would have used a different term, which he uses in chapter 9. He says, look, I've sown spiritual things among you, so I should be able to reap physical, material things. And there he uses sarkikos. So that would have been a better term if Paul was meaning to contrast the physical or material with immaterial. That's how he would have done it, not using pneumatikos there. What I think Paul is saying in that text is he's saying, look, it's sown a natural body. It's animated by its natural organs, lungs, liver, kidneys, heart, and it's raised a spiritual body. It's animated by the Holy Spirit there. I think that's the best interpretation of what Paul's saying. And then in verse 50 he says, he wants to make it clear that flesh and blood cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. So people will contrast that with, I think it's Luke 24:39, where Jesus, risen Jesus says, flesh and bone, a spirit does not have flesh and bone as you see that I have. But flesh and bone is different from flesh and blood. You say, oh boy, that's really, really pushing it. Well, it's not, because we can show through the Jewish writings of that day that flesh and blood was a figure of speech, just referring to the mortal body. It's like today we have something, we'll talk about a red-blooded male or a cold-blooded murderer. Excuse me.
God bless
it
you.
has nothing to do with the color of someone's blood. It has nothing to do with the temperature of their blood. And so when they said flesh and blood back then, it was a figure of speech referring to the mortal body. It had nothing, not necessarily the physicality of it. So Paul in 1 Corinthians 50 really is not saying anything about the nature of Jesus's resurrection. So yeah. So those are the things. It's talking about bodily resurrection. We find that in Paul. We find it throughout the Gospels. It wasn't a spiritual resurrection.
Okay, and the fact that he was an enemy of the church when he was proclaiming that, what significance as a historian does that give to his testimony of the resurrection?
Would you repeat that?
That he was an enemy of the faith, that he was a persecutor of the faith. What significance does that give to his proclamation of the resurrection or his claim to experience the resurrection?
Well, let's just suppose, of course, you're on the other side of the pond. So you may not be so familiar with American politics, but let's just say that Kamala Harris, who is our vice president, came out publicly in a press conference and said, you know what? I've changed my mind about Donald Trump. I think he would be the best, our next best, our best choice for president in the elections next year. I mean, that would be huge. That would be huge, because now you have a hostile source who is saying something very positive about the opposition. What you have here with Paul is he's the opposition, and he's saying about Jesus, he had been out persecuting because he believed Jesus was a heretic. He believed he was a false prophet and a failed Messiah. So all of a sudden, so he was persecuting the church because he believed it was detrimental to Judaism. And now he is now becoming part of this faith, of this movement. And if he didn't believe it were true, he would believe that he is sacrificing the eternal health of his soul in doing so. And now he's proclaiming Jesus as Lord, not only just as Messiah, but he's proclaiming him as Lord and holding him as God's uniquely divine Son and the only way that one can have eternal life. He even believed his former way of life as a Jew without Christ was people who held that position as a Jew without believing in Christ were going to be eternally damned. He says this in Romans chapter 10, and he prays for the salvation of his fellow Jews, that they would come to know the Messiah. He even says, I would prefer that I would be damned to hell forever if it would mean that my fellow countrymen, the Jews, would follow Jesus. So this is a guy who was out persecuting the church, and now he becomes a Christian, a follower of Jesus. He endures severe persecution and even dies as a Christian martyr as a result of it. So I think that's pretty strong.
Yeah, I think it's an important thing for people to consider when they're considering, is the Christian claim true? In the absence of a better explanation, the fact that an enemy of the faith, a persecutor of the faith by his own admission, has come to the faith, a faith that he didn't found. That's quite a significant point for people to weigh up in their own mind. Just to, in terms of some of I do want to sort of swing back around to one of the other big theories that are pointed out, but as a sort of precursor to that, comment briefly on the empty tomb, because I know that's one of the kind of key touchstones of this debate, or at least classically it was. What's your views on the idea of the empty tomb as a historian?
I think it was empty.
Right. So you believe there was a tomb? Because I know Dr. Bart Ehrman tries to argue that the whole story of the tomb was made up.
Yeah, I think he's just being uber skeptical there. You have Josephus, who when he's reporting on the Jewish war, he is saying that he talked about some Idumean Jews who came in and attacked Jerusalem because they didn't like the Jerusalem Jewish leadership. So they attacked Jerusalem and they had this war. And Josephus reports that the Jews in Jerusalem became enraged because the Idumeans would kill some Jews and they would not allow them to receive a proper burial. And Josephus says that prior to that time, and we're talking probably around the year 67, 68 when this is occurring, he said prior to then, the Romans allowed the Jews to remove the crucified and condemned and to give them a proper burial prior to sunset.
Oh, wow.
So that's what Josephus, the Jewish historian, is reporting. Now, Ehrman tries to downplay that, but I think he really does an ad hoc job and it's very unpersuasive. Josephus is pretty clear here. Plus, we could go ahead and apply one of the criteria that Ehrman thinks is the most valuable in adjudicating the historical deeds of Jesus, and that is multiple independent sources. So we have a burial by Joseph of Arimathea in his tomb reported in all four Gospels. And even if we want to say that the burial by Joseph reported in Matthew and Luke, they're using Mark as their primary source, you still have John. And even though scholars debate on whether John was familiar with Mark or any of the synoptic Gospels, the large majority of Johannine specialists will say that they believe that John is writing independently. He might have been aware of Mark, but he's writing independently of Mark. And again, if you look at where the majority of scholars are today, John's primary source, if it's not written by a minor disciple of Jesus, whoever wrote it is using one of Jesus' disciples as their primary source. And then Mark is using Peter as his primary source. So both accounts, independent of one another, they're closely rooted in eyewitness testimony of one of Jesus' disciples, and they are different disciples. So you have multiple independent sources on the burial by Joseph, at minimum, with Mark and with John. And then you've got Josephus that talks about how the crucified were given a proper burial. And then you even have it in archaeology, because in the 1960s, you had the discovery of Yehohanan, the crucified remains of Yehohanan, a guy in his early to mid 20s. They found his remains in an ossuary, which means he was given a proper burial in Jerusalem, in a tomb. And they went back a year later, they collected his bones and put them in there. And they know he was crucified because one of the crucifixion nails is still embedded in his ankle bone. So, that's pretty convincing. Archaeological evidence, documentary evidence, and an unsympathetic source who would corroborate how crucified victims in Jerusalem were permitted a proper burial prior to sunset.
And that obviously presents a great problem to anyone who's trying to suggest that it was someone else crucified in Jesus's place, because we've still got an empty tomb to explain. It would also cause problems, I guess, for those that argue for hallucination, because we've still got an empty tomb to explain. So what sort of arguments are made to to counter the idea of the resurrection, to explain an empty tomb? One, obviously, we've already dismissed as being a bit ad hoc from Dr. Bart Ehrman. Well, have you heard any other good explanations to try and explain away the empty tomb? And if so, which of them do you rate as being, worth considering?
To be honest with you, I mean, nobody really takes stolen body anymore. They just tend to reject an empty tomb, but they don't go with stolen body because they see that the disciples truly believe that Jesus rose and appeared to them. And if they stole the body, of course, they wouldn't believe that, right?
Yeah.
So that's a problem. And then even if the disciples did steal the body and died, suffered continuously for something they knew to be a lie, which we have already shown is very unlikely, you still have the problem with Paul. And Paul would have suspected. That would have been his first suspicion when it comes to the proclamation of the resurrection of Jesus. If there was an empty tomb, he would have just thought that the disciples had stolen the body or that they went to the wrong tomb. Now, of course, if they went to the wrong tomb, they would have, the Jewish authorities or Roman authorities would have just gone to the correct tomb and said, hey, you guys went to the wrong tomb. It's in here. That's not something that we find happen. And it's interesting to note that the ancient sources that dispute or report, either dispute or report disputes over the empty tomb, they don't try to explain it away. They just tried to give natural explanations on why the tomb was empty. So Kelsa says that, as I mentioned earlier, that Jesus used magic that he learned from Egypt, and he came out from the tomb alive. So that's one thing. That's explaining the empty tomb. You have Justin Martyr in the middle of the 2nd century in his dialogue with Trypho, saying that the Jewish leadership had appointed certain men to go around saying that the disciples stole Jesus' body, and they continue to do so to this very day. So even when Justin is writing this, there were Jewish men going around saying the disciples had stolen the body of Jesus, which is affirming why the tomb was empty. It was affirming that the tomb was empty. You wouldn't say the disciples stole the body to explain a tomb that was still occupied.
And that would be another independent source to the empty tomb.
Yeah, well, an independent reason. I mean,
because you've got a tradition.
It's explaining why it's empty. Explain why it's empty in the middle of the 2nd century, of course.
But it's a tradition, isn't it? That would you say, or maybe I'm jumping the gun here. Would you say that is evidence of a tradition that?
Absolutely. A tradition that continued to his day that was being spread by the Jewish leadership, right?
Yeah.
The non-Christian leadership. And, Matthew, when he reports it, he says that the Jews had paid the guards to say this. The Jewish leadership had paid the guards to say this. And that continues to this very day. So Matthew, whenever he wrote, it was still being proclaimed when he wrote, whether he's writing in the 60s or the 70s or the 80s. Whenever Matthew's writing, you have the Jewish leadership that are spreading the rumor even to that day that the disciples had stolen the body. And then you have Tertullian in the late 2nd century, early 3rd century, saying that the rumor was going around that there was the gardener of where the tombs were who had a lettuce patch there. And he feared that people coming to venerate Jesus at the tomb would trample over his lettuce. So he reburied the body, which is another natural alternative to explain why the tomb was empty. None of them are disputing that the tomb was empty. They're giving alternative reasons of why the tomb was empty. So
that's amazing.
Yeah, we've got some good reasons to think that there was an empty tomb.
That's really beautiful. I just because I often hear people say, "Well, you don't know who wrote the Gospels." What relevance does knowledge of who wrote the Gospels have to the 1st century experience of the resurrection?
Well, apart from the Gospels, we still know a whole lot from Paul, right? Because we can get back not only from Paul and knowing that he's preaching the same gospels as the gospel as the Jerusalem apostles, the essential message of the Christian faith. We also see that that he's embedded oral tradition that most likely goes back to the Jerusalem apostles themselves. So even apart from the Gospels, we can know quite a bit in terms of a nice outline about Jesus. But those who say we have no idea who wrote the Gospels, they usually say that because for a number of reasons. They'll say, well, all the Gospels are anonymous. They don't include the author's name in a title or the proem. And the Gospel authors were, I'm sorry, Jesus' disciples were illiterate. So Matthew and John could not have written those Gospels. Mark and Luke, of course, were not part of the 12, so it doesn't apply to them. So my response to that is take a look at other ancient biographies written in that period. And what you will find is that virtually all of them are anonymous, formally anonymous in the same sense the Gospels are. There are about 90 biographies that have been written about people, and they were written within 150 years on each side of Jesus. 150 years, so that's a 300-year span with, let's say, Jesus in the middle. And of those approximate 90 biographies, only one of them has the name, well, none of them have the name of the author in the title, and only one has the name of the author in the proem. And that is Lucian of Samosata's Passing of Peregrinus. He mentions his name as he's writing to his patron. That's it. All the rest of them are anonymous in the same sense the Gospels are. Well, Mike, you're cherry picking here, because if you went just a few years more than 150 years, then you have all sorts of biographies that are written. Well, even if that were true, and it's not, but even if it were true, you still have than 150 years of the time of Jesus on each side, which is an era. It shows that that was the practice of those historians, biographers, not to mention their name in the title or the proem. But again, that it's false to even suggest that, because the very next extant biography is the life of Elias in the Historia Augusta, which is regarded by historians as entirely unreliable, historically speaking. And that is written in the final decade of the 4th century. So that's far you have to go to get the next biography that mentions the author's name in the title or the proem. So it was a standard practice. It was a rare exception to find the author's name in the title or the proem when we're talking about a biography. And it's also that way in a number of histories. So how do we know that these people like Plutarch wrote that? Well, for example, Plutarch is regarded by classicists as the finest ancient biographer. A lot of what we know about the ancient world comes from Plutarch. And Plutarch's name doesn't appear in any of the 48 extant biographies from him. He wrote over 60, but 48 have survived. His name doesn't appear in any of them, not in the title, not in the proem, not in the body of the literature, nowhere. So why do classicists believe that Plutarch wrote those? Well, our best source is called the Lamprias Catalog, which was written at least 200 years after Plutarch wrote and is falsely attributed to Plutarch's son. And it contains literature in this catalog that most classicists would say Plutarch didn't write a number of literature that's listed in there that's attributed to him. Yet that, despite the fact that that is our earliest and our best source for Plutarch writing the lives, the 48 biographies that have survived, classicists are unanimous in saying that Plutarch wrote those. Well, Bob, the evidence that we have, the external and internal evidence that we have for the traditional authorship of our 4 Gospels is far better than what we have that Plutarch wrote the lives. So I could go on with that, but if you're going to call into question the traditional authorship of our 4 Gospels, and listen, it's not that the traditional authorship is unimpeachable. It's not unimpeachable. Our evidence for the traditional authorship is not perfect, far from it, but it's better than what we have for a lot of other ancient sources that historians do not call into question.
And that's the thing, isn't it? There is this common double standard applied to New Testament literature that, comparable to other literature from a similar period, there's this double standard in what we expect of it, and what we apply to it, isn't there? And I'm just wondering, why do you think that is? Why have we got a sort of double standard in terms of how we measure the Gospels versus how we measure other literature from a similar period in terms of questions around authorship, reliability, and so on and so forth?
Well, I think one reason, and it doesn't apply to all, but one reason is just going to be the worldview of the historian, of the scholar. If you are not favorably inclined toward Jesus and Christianity, well, then you're going to look for reasons. You're going to look to be skeptical of those, and I can understand that. So, I mean, I think that's probably a major reason. And another one would be, you look at these things, and we do have our wish lists. We wish. I remember hearing the prominent historian of Jesus, John Meyer, who died within the last couple of years. He taught at Notre Dame. And I heard him give a lecture once, and he said, being a historian is like playing cards in a sense. You wish that you had more cards. You wish that the cards you had were better, but you have to play the hand you've been dealt. And so it's like that with historians. We wish we had more sources. We wish the sources we had were better, but we have to play the hand we've been dealt, the sources we've been dealt. And I happen to think that the sources we have for Jesus are pretty good. To think, especially like we've said with Mark and John, I'm not discounting Matthew and Luke here, but of Mark and John, even if we go with the majority opinion of critical scholars, they're closely rooted in eyewitness testimony of one of Jesus's disciples. That's really good stuff. They are written within 20 to 65 years of the death of Jesus. That is really good stuff by ancient standards. And so you have multiple independent sources that are rooted in multiple eyewitnesses. That's really good. And then you got Paul, who was an unsympathetic, even a hostile source, who comes around, and he's got close connections with the eyewitnesses. That's really good stuff. Is it perfect? No. Do I wish we had another source to verify some of the things Paul said? Like, would it be nice to discover a letter that the high priest Caiaphas sent to the synagogue in Damascus saying, hey, we've got this former Pharisee named Saul of Tarsus who has recently become a Christian, and now he's out spreading the gospel. He used to persecute the Christians, and now he's out trying to convert people to Christianity, to follow this dead Messiah, Jesus, saying that he'd been raised from the dead and actually had appeared to Paul. Oh, it'd be wonderful to have a letter like that. Well, we don't, but we play the hand we've been dealt, and we've got some pretty good sources. So I think what ends up happening is some of the scholars, you have a wish list, and we think that we should have everything that we want. But when you go to antiquity, you just don't get that with anything else. I recently spoke to some students at a prep school here in Atlanta, a Christian prep school. And the dean of that school, when I was talking about the resurrection of Jesus, lecturing to the kids, and they were very sharp, he jumps out of his seat. I mean, this guy was animated. Now, he had a master's degree in history from Cambridge, and then he did a PhD in history at Emory University. And he jumps out of his seat when we were talking about one of my debates with Ehrman that I had with him years ago. And he said, Ehrman says that he wants this wish list of, he wants multiple independent sources, and he doesn't want them to have any conflicting details and things. And all these things that he says a wish list. Yeah, of course we want these things. But if Ehrman wants them, he needs to study modern history, not ancient history, because we don't have a lot of those things in ancient history. And he was just going on as a historian with a PhD in history from a great university. He says, Ehrman's no historian. He claims to be, but he isn't, because he says if he were a real historian, he wouldn't be demanding these kinds of things which aren't available in ancient history.
Fantastic. So I do have a question. It's more of a commentary with about Bart Ehrman's approach that I'd ask you to sort of bounce off and respond to. Is that I know that Dr. Ehrman recognizes a number of different things, like these are affirmations of Bart Ehrman about Christ. So obviously Christ was a real person. Christ was a prophetic, apocalyptic prophetic figure in the first century. That he went around preaching the coming of the kingdom of God. That he was indeed crucified. And he accepts, for instance, that Mary saw something that convinced her that Christ had risen from the dead. Peter saw something that convinced him that Christ had risen from the dead. Paul saw something that convinced him that Christ had risen from the dead. Now, I'm going to just segue those three admissions off from Bart Ehrman, the three people that he acknowledges as having seen Christ risen from the dead. And just return to Bart Ehrman's perceptions of Jesus. I believe, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, because I know you're friends with Dr. Bart Ehrman, that I believe that he believes that Christ was seen as a miracle worker, and he obviously gets all of this from the New Testament literature.
Actually, Bob, he doesn't think that.
It does it. Which part? Which part? Sorry.
Yeah. Bart Ehrman does not think that during Jesus's lifetime that he was regarded as a miracle or exorcist.
Okay, so I take that one back. I take that one back.
He says that in his book, Jesus Before the Gospels. And in that sense, he stands alone. I've talked to two historians of Jesus who have specialized in miracles. They know where scholars are on this. And I said, I asked both of them, are you aware of, I know it's common throughout historians of Jesus to say that Jesus was known as a miracle worker and exorcist during his lifetime. Are you aware of any other historians of Jesus who would say Jesus was not known in that sense during his lifetime? They said they couldn't think of any. And I said, well, Bart Ehrman is now saying he doesn't think Jesus was known as a miracle worker or exorcist during his lifetime. And they said, wow, they were surprised. And they said they're not aware of a single other scholar, no matter how skeptical, who had such a view.
Okay, so he's in a minority on that point.
A minority of one.
Yeah, which is a good point to know. Because rhetorically, Bart often likes to talk about how all scholars agree with him, and it's nice to hear from a scholar.
He said that about the Gospels too, right? Scholars say we don't know who wrote them, and that's just false.
Yeah, totally. So my question is, or the bit that I'd like to bounce off, because I'll never get a chance to ask Dr. Bart Ehrman this question myself, but how does he ground the affirmations that he does make about Christ, which obviously he's got to be taking from the Gospels and other New Testament literature? How does he ground the affirmations that he makes whilst then selectively choosing to deny the resurrection, which is grounded in the same material evidence?
Well, you're right. He's selective there. So he's going to use things. His primary criterion would be multiple independent sources. And so he's going to conclude a number of things about Jesus based on criteria such as that and some others. But you're right. He's going to be select. Then when it comes to him being a miracle worker, known as a miracle worker. I mean, he wouldn't even have to. These historians of Jesus who say Jesus was known miracle worker and exorcist during his lifetime, they're not necessarily saying that Jesus was truly a divine miracle worker and exorcist. They're just saying Jesus did some things that astonished crowds and that led people to believe that he was a miracle worker and exorcist. And that's pretty unanimous. As far as we know, Bart's the only historian of Jesus who would deny that. But he's going to be select. So when he applies that same criteria to other things, he's going to deny it. So, for example, the deity of Jesus, he used to say that the Gospels, except for John, did not teach the deity of Jesus. And then he came to understand that even Mark, the earliest Gospel, teaches the deity of Jesus. But he doesn't think that Jesus actually claimed it. Well, then I would look at that and I'd say, well, wait a minute. You've got all these multiple independent sources, early sources, sources that are rooted in eyewitness testimony. You've got Paul, all these kinds of things, all these kinds of sources where they believe Jesus is God's uniquely divine son. Even Yahweh, they think he's Lord. So how do they arrive at this view at such an early state? And the people who knew Jesus personally, how did they, as pious Jews, arrive at such a view if Jesus had not made such claims or did such things that would have led them to this kind of conclusion? You just have to apply some sober-minded historical investigation. Do not let your worldview get involved and just look at the data and see where it leads. And it leads quite conclusively to Jesus believing and claiming to be God's uniquely divine son. There's just no way around it because it's attested so early and in multiple independent sources that are rooted in eyewitness testimony of those who had actually seen and known Jesus.
So would it be fair to say that Dr. Urban is working to a bit of a double standard in that I'll apply my methodology in some cases, but then ignore my own methodology in other cases because of some presuppositional prejudice?
I think so. Only he knows what's in his heart. But, at the end of our last debate, he made some statements and you could see where he is ideologically driven. And so, I'm not just saying he's the only one. I mean, Christians are ideologically driven. I'm ideologically driven. I am a Christian. I believe that Jesus is who he claimed to be. I believe a lot of what the Gospels say. So just because, he's ideologically driven, I'm ideologically driven, but you can see that it's a matter of whose arguments are better and who really tried to approach this with an even, trying to be as fair as possible with the evidence. Now he's going to claim he did. I'm going to claim that I did. Your viewers don't have to believe either of us. In fact, you shouldn't believe either of us at just our face value, because frankly, I or Bart could truly believe that we've come at this in an even-handed way and believe that we have done this as neutrally as possible, but we've deceived ourselves. So it'll be up to your viewers to look at the arguments themselves. Listen to what Bart says, read it, listen to him, view what he says, do the same with what I'm saying here, and make your own judgment on that. That's the only way that we can really operate in that sense, because there's no necessarily higher authority here on earth who can say, well, Bart, you're right, Mike's wrong, or Mike, you're right, Bart's wrong, because then they could be wrong in their adjudication. People have to decide for themselves.
Wonderful. How long have I got you for before you need to go?
About 2 minutes.
About 2 minutes. Then I just want to say thank you so much for spending time with us today and gracing us with your presence. I've really enjoyed this. I'm sure it's been a great blessing to other people. One final question. Who do you think I should have on next as a guest to talk about this topic or another topic? Who would you recommend I try to get on the show?
Well, you should try to get Bart.
I have. He wants to charge me £1,000 an hour.
Oh,
You know,
well,
so
I can, yeah, I can kind of understand that a lot of us get all these invitations to be interviewed, and typically, most of us don't charge, or sometimes we'll charge a minimal fee, or people just pay us a minimal fee. But yeah, it can be quite time consuming, and I guess he gets a lot of invitations.
And I just
I
want
would
to say
say,
to you, go on, I'll let you answer the question and then I'll.
yeah, why don't you try to get Craig Keener? He's good. Justin Bass would be someone good. Boy, there are just so many. Daryl Bach, Dan Wallace, William Lane Craig, Gary Habermas. Tell you what, there's someone else you should have on. His name's Ben Shaw, and he did his doctoral dissertation under Gary Habermas. He did it on the resurrection of Jesus. I was an external reader for it. And he's excellent. And he's getting started as a scholar. And he knows, I would say right now, he's one of the leading experts on the resurrection of Jesus. So so I would have Ben on. He's really good.
Ben Shaw, I will endeavor to do so. I just want to say, to Dr. Licona's credit, he has neither asked me for any money for these 2 hours of his time, nor did he even ask me to promote his book or anything else, which is just a sign of his heart and his willingness to serve our Lord for the joy of serving our Lord. So with that, if there's anything you would like to promote, I'm inviting you to do so. If there's anything you want to mention or to promote,
sure.
I've already promoted your book and I'll do it again.
Well,
it's a great
thanks,
book,
Bob.
The Resurrection of Jesus, a new historiographical approach. That's the cover. It's an absolute beast, but it's a great read. And Mike did not ask me to do that at all, I swear. So is there anything you'd just like to promote before you go?
Well, I have a website, risenjesus.com. I also have a YouTube channel, so just type in my name in YouTube and you'll see the channel come up. There's almost 500 videos there. Check out the playlists because they have some of the main videos that are used. I've got most of my debates are on there. I've got lots of lectures, things on the formation of the biblical canon, English translations, the New Testament Greek texts, and the historical reliability of the Gospels. Several of my debates with Bart Ehrman are on there. So there's a lot of resources on my YouTube channel. And then I also like to say, if anyone's really interested in learning this kinds of stuff through either Christian apologetics or maybe having a master's degree in theological studies or even in philosophy, where I teach at Houston Christian University, we've got a number of great programs, undergrad and grad programs. A person can complete a Master of Arts in Theological Studies or a Master of Arts in Christian Apologetics entirely online. If you want more information, go to hc.edu/defend. So thanks for letting me promote this. Thanks, Bob.
Yeah, if you send me those links, I'll add them to the description box for future reference. Thank you so much, Dr. Licona. I don't hide the fact that I am a fan. I genuinely do appreciate your work. I've been very blessed by it myself. And I know you need to get off. So Christ is risen, and have a happy Easter.
Thanks. Christ is risen indeed.
Amen. God bless.